A millionaire remarried a sinister woman after his wife passed away. A few days later, his 2 daughters had to pack off because the house on Willow Lane had once been alive with warmth. Sunlight seemed to linger longer in its corners, drawn by the laughter that spilled from its rooms. The walls held memories, the smell of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen, Sarah's voice humming soft melodies as she tucked Maria and Janice into bed. Now, silence stretched through the halls, heavy and unyielding. George sat at the edge of the living room couch, his tie loosened, his suit jacket crumpled beside him. His fingers traced the curve of a photograph frame he had brought down earlier, a candid shot of Sarah, caught mid-laugh, her hair framing her face in soft waves. The girls had insisted on putting the picture back on the mantel that morning, as if even a slight disturbance in its placement could unmoor them further. Maria, only 6 but fiercely protective, curled against his side. Her small hand rested on his knee, a silent gesture of comfort for the man she now saw as lost. Janice, clutching her frayed stuffed rabbit, sat cross-legged on the carpet near his feet, her lips moving as if whispering to herself. It wasn't words, not really, just soft, fractured murmurs, as though her mind searched for something tangible to fill the void. "It's so quiet now," Maria finally said, her voice a whisper. George shifted, his throat tight. He wanted to respond, to tell her that the quiet was temporary, that one day the house would hum again, with life. But the words stuck, caught behind the lump in his chest. Instead, he nodded, the weight of her observation pressing down like a stone. "Does she stay up there?" Janice asked suddenly, glancing at the ceiling with wide, questioning eyes. Maria shot her a look, her cheeks reddening. "Don't be stupid. Mama's not here anymore." Her voice cracked, betraying her forced composure. "Maria," George said softly, his voice firmer than he intended. The sharpness made her flinch, and he immediately regretted it. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder, and she didn't pull away. "I just meant," Janice whispered, eyes dropping to her rabbit, "maybe she visits, like angels do in the books." George closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. How could he explain to them something he didn't fully grasp himself? His gaze fell to the floor, the thick Persian rug they used to sprawl across during family game nights. Back then, Sarah would be the referee, laughing as Maria accused Janice of cheating. Now that laughter was just an echo, a memory that the house struggled to retain. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "Maybe she does. Maybe she's with us in ways we can't see." The words felt hollow, insufficient, but it was the best he could manage. Janice climbed into his lap, pressing her cheek against his chest. She didn't cry, neither of them had since the funeral, though tears sat on the edges of everything they did. He wrapped his arms around her, his grip tightening, as if to tether himself to her presence. The doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness. Maria jumped up, her small feet padding across the hardwood floor. "I'll get it," she said, grateful for the distraction. A moment later she returned, followed by Rebecca. Dressed simply in a light cardigan and slacks, she carried a tray of cookies wrapped in cellophane. Her auburn hair, tied neatly into a low ponytail, framed a face that exuded an effortless charm. "I thought I'd stop by," Rebecca said, her tone light but gentle. "It's hard, those first few weeks. I thought you might need something sweet." She placed the tray on the coffee table and crouched slightly, smiling at the girls. "And I remembered Maria loves chocolate chip." Maria gave a hesitant smile, her manners pushing her to mumble, "Thank you." But she didn't move closer. George stood, adjusting his shirt. "That's kind of you, Rebecca," he said, his voice polite, almost distant. He didn't know her well. She was an acquaintance from the country club, someone who had shown surprising attentiveness since Sarah's passing. Rebecca waved a hand dismissively, her eyes flicking toward Maria and Janice. "It's nothing. I just know how much they must miss her." Her voice softened, almost too much. "And how hard it must be for you, George." He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "We're managing," he said, though the effort behind those words was plain. Rebecca lingered, her gaze shifting between him and the girls, as if evaluating the fractures in their family. "Well, if you need anything," she added, "I'm just a call away." George nodded again, his eyes drifting back to his daughters as Rebecca left. Maria had returned to his side, her hand finding his once more. The cookies sat untouched on the table. The house was silent again. George leaned back into the couch, pulling his daughters close. The photo of Sarah, smiling from the mantel, caught the fading light of the afternoon. For the first time, he allowed the tears to come, silent and unbidden, as his daughters held him steady. The smell of cookies lingered in the air long after Rebecca left, mingling with the faint scent of roses from the bouquet someone had sent the week before. George sat at the dining table, watching Maria and Janice shuffle quietly in the living room. Maria was flipping through a book she wasn't reading. Janice clutched her rabbit, staring blankly at the untouched tray of cookies. Their silence gnawed at him. Rebecca had started stopping by more frequently. Her timing was always impeccable, appearing just as the girls began to withdraw, or when George seemed particularly tired. Today, she had returned within days of her last visit, this time with a casserole. "It's not much," she had said, setting it on the counter with practiced ease. "But I know how hard it can be to keep everything going, especially with two little ones who need you." George had thanked her, his gratitude genuine, but he'd been hesitant to let the girls feel too much of her presence. Yet Rebecca had a way of slipping into their world seamlessly. She never lingered too long, never pushed too hard. Her gestures were thoughtful, her demeanor kind, and George, buried under his own grief and the mounting responsibility of raising two young children, found it hard to resist her offers of help. As the days passed, Rebecca's visits became part of the rhythm of their lives. She brought meals, offered to organize the growing stack of condolence letters, and even helped Maria with a school project one afternoon. Maria had been polite, but distant, her small voice barely audible as she explained the assignment. Janice, however, kept her eyes down, her grip on her rabbit tightening whenever Rebecca spoke to her. George noticed it, but he dismissed it as the girls adjusting to a new presence. After all, Rebecca was only trying to help. One evening, Rebecca arrived unannounced, carrying a basket of fresh linens. "I thought you could use these," she said brightly, "and I noticed the staff hasn't been around much lately." She paused, her tone softening. "I hope that's not adding to your stress." George hesitated, leaning against the doorway. "They've been giving us space. It's been quieter." Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense. Sometimes too many people around can make things harder, not easier. I know when my sister lost her husband, she found the constant activity overwhelming." She smiled, a quiet, understanding smile. "I can help fill in the gaps. It might be simpler to keep things close-knit for now." Her words lingered in George's mind long after she left. That night, as he sat in his study, sorting through the financial paperwork that had piled up since Sarah's passing, he found himself considering her suggestion. There was something appealing about the idea of streamlining the household, of focusing on the family without the intrusion of outsiders, and Rebecca seemed more than willing to shoulder some of the load. But not everyone felt at ease with her growing presence. Maria and Janice were sitting at the kitchen table the next morning when Rebecca arrived again, this time with a set of paints and brushes. "Thought you two might like this," she said, her tone warm and inviting. "Art can be such a wonderful way to express feelings you don't have words for." She set the supplies down carefully, her gaze shifting between them. "Your mum always spoke so fondly of your creativity, Maria." Maria nodded politely, muttering a quiet, "Thank you." She glanced at Janice, whose shoulders had stiffened. Rebecca reached out, lightly brushing Janice's hair back. "You have your mother's eyes," she said softly, her voice tinged with nostalgia. But the way Janice flinched, ever so slightly, didn't escape Maria's notice. After Rebecca left, Maria set the paints aside, folding her arms on the table. "I don't like her," she said quietly, glancing toward her sister. Janice hesitated, then whispered, "She's nice to Daddy." Maria didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the basket of cookies Rebecca had brought earlier, the cellophane still tied neatly with a red ribbon. "She's too nice," she muttered, her voice almost inaudible. Janice bit her lip, but said nothing. They didn't know how to explain it, not even to themselves. There was something about Rebecca, her constant presence, her soothing words, her perfectly timed kindness, that felt wrong. But George, so weighed down by his own grief, couldn't see it. For him, Rebecca's gestures felt like a lifeline, a balm to the growing chaos in his mind. Later that evening, Rebecca stayed for dinner at George's suggestion. She cleared the dishes afterward, shooing the girls away when they offered to help. "Go relax," she said with a smile. "I'll handle it." Standing in the doorway, Maria watched her rinse the plates, her movements precise and efficient. Maria clenched her fists, her unease growing as Rebecca hummed softly under her breath, a tune that sounded too much like the one their mother used to sing. As the months passed, Rebecca's presence in their lives grew deeper, more permanent. She no longer just stopped by. She began to stay. George, weighed down by the ache of loss and the demands of work, found comfort in Rebecca's unwavering support. Her ability to anticipate his needs, to lighten the load without complaint, seemed like a gift sent at just the right time. He didn't question her intentions, only the relief she brought. "I don't know what we'd do without you," he said one evening, watching her from the kitchen table as she plated dinner. The girls sat nearby, their heads bowed, quietly picking at their food. Rebecca smiled, a soft, practiced curve of her lips. "You're a strong man, George. But even the strongest need someone to lean on." Her words lingered, their weight settling into the spaces George had tried to ignore, the spaces left by Sarah. It was true. He needed someone. The girls needed someone. Rebecca seemed to fill that role effortlessly. Soon, the suggestion came naturally, almost as if it were George's own idea. They were sitting by the fireplace after the girls had gone to bed. The soft glow of the flames painted the room in warm tones, and Rebecca was curled in the armchair across from him, a cup of tea in her hands. "Have you ever thought about staying?" George asked, his voice tentative. Rebecca tilted her head, her expression one of gentle surprise. "Staying?" "With us," he clarified, his words coming quicker now. "You're already so much a part of our lives. I see how much the girls are beginning to trust you, and I trust you." Rebecca set her cup down, leaning forward slightly. "George, I would never want to impose. It wouldn't be an imposition," he said firmly. "It feels right." Rebecca's hesitation was brief and calculated before she gave him a soft, understanding smile. "If you're sure." Their wedding was a quiet affair, a small gathering of close friends and family. Rebecca wore a simple ivory gown, her hair swept back into an elegant bun. George's eyes lingered on her as she walked down the aisle, a glimmer of hope in his gaze for the first time in years. Maria and Janice stood to the side, dressed in matching pale blue dresses, their expressions unreadable. The reception was held in the garden of their estate, the same garden Sarah had once tended with care. The flowers were in bloom, their fragrance mixing with the crisp autumn air. Rebecca moved through the crowd with ease, her laugh light and infectious, her hand resting on George's arm, as though it had always belonged there. Maria sat with Janice at a corner table, their plates untouched. "She's not like Mama," Maria said, her voice low enough that only Janice could hear. Janice looked down, fiddling with her fork. "Daddy seems happy." Maria's gaze flicked toward Rebecca, who was chatting with one of George's business partners. Her movements were graceful, almost too perfect. Maria's stomach twisted. "It doesn't feel right." Janice didn't answer. After the wedding, Rebecca settled into her role as the new mistress of the house. Her demeanor toward George remained warm and attentive, her affection unwavering. But the changes came slowly, subtly, like a creeping shadow. "The staff," she said one evening as they sat together in the study, George going over business documents. "I've been thinking, do we really need so many of them?" George glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Why? Are they not doing their jobs?" "Oh, they're fine," Rebecca said quickly, brushing a hand against his arm. "But it's such a large household, and the girls are older now. I thought it might be simpler for us to manage things more. Personally." George hesitated, but Rebecca's smile was soothing. "It would make the house feel more intimate," she added, "like a real home." By the end of the week, most of the staff had been let go. Rebecca insisted on handling everything herself, from the cleaning to the cooking. To George, her dedication seemed selfless and admirable. To Maria and Janice, it felt suffocating. Rebecca's warmth toward the girls began to cool. Her once gentle words became clipped, her smiles fleeting. When George was around, she remained the doting stepmother, but in his absence, her gaze was sharp, her tone edged with impatience. One evening, as Rebecca stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, Maria approached cautiously. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice tentative. Rebecca didn't turn. "No. Go set the table," she said curtly. Maria hesitated, her small hands fidgeting. "But I want to—" "I said, set the table," Rebecca snapped, her voice low but firm. Maria flinched, retreating without another word. Janice, watching from the doorway, clutched her rabbit tighter. "She's scary," she whispered when Maria joined her in the dining room. Maria nodded, her jaw tight. "I know." The days that followed were quiet, the girls' unease growing with each passing moment. George, preoccupied with work, didn't notice the subtle shift in the household, but Maria did, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending everything was fine. George stood in the dining room, a stack of papers in hand, his brow furrowed in thought. The warm morning light filtered through the windows, casting long streaks of gold across the polished table. Maria and Janice sat quietly at their usual spots, their breakfast untouched. Rebecca moved efficiently around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes the only sound breaking the silence. "I have some news," George began, his tone gentle but edged with reluctance. He looked toward his daughters and then at Rebecca, as though gauging their reactions. "I've been asked to handle a series of meetings in Europe. It's important for the company." Maria stiffened, her gaze flicking to Rebecca, who paused mid-motion, her expression calm and measured. Janice tightened her grip on her rabbit, her shoulders hunching slightly. "How long will you be gone?" Maria asked, her voice steady but low. "A couple of weeks," George replied. "Maybe 3. I'll try to keep it as short as I can." He sighed and placed the papers on the table. "I know it's not ideal, but Rebecca will be here to take care of everything. She's done such a wonderful job already." Maria glanced down at her plate, biting the inside of her cheek. George's faith in Rebecca was unshakable, and Maria knew better than to challenge it outright. Janice, on the other hand, couldn't hide the flicker of fear that crossed her face. Rebecca stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on George's arm. "Don't worry about a thing," she said, her tone warm and soothing. "The girls and I will manage just fine. You should focus on your work." George smiled, a trace of gratitude softening his features. "I knew I could count on you." Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, George sat in his study, going over his travel itinerary. Rebecca entered quietly, a cup of tea in hand. She placed it on the desk and perched on the edge of a nearby chair, her movements graceful and deliberate. "You're sure this isn't too much for you?" George asked, glancing up at her. "I hate leaving the girls for so long." Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "George, you've done so much for them already. This trip is important and they'll be fine. I'll make sure of it." Her confidence seemed to ease his guilt, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe everything would be as smooth as she promised. The morning of his departure came quickly. The house was bustling with last-minute preparations, but the energy felt hollow. Maria and Janice lingered by the doorway as George adjusted his tie, Rebecca standing beside him with her usual poised demeanor. "Be good for Rebecca," George said, crouching down to the girls' level. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, his gaze steady and full of affection. "I'll call every chance I get, and I'll be back before you know it." Maria nodded, her face carefully neutral. Janice clung to her rabbit, tears brimming in her eyes. "Promise you'll come back soon," Janice whispered. "I promise," George said softly, pulling them into a tight embrace. Rebecca stepped forward as he rose, giving him a reassuring smile. "We'll be just fine. Travel safe." George hesitated for a moment, his eyes lingering on the girls, before finally stepping out the door. Maria and Janice watched in silence as his car disappeared down the long driveway, the weight of his absence settling heavily around them. By that afternoon, the shift was palpable. Rebecca's warm facade began to slip, her tone sharper, her smiles absent. "Maria, clear the dishes," she said curtly after lunch, not bothering to look up from her book. Maria stared at her. "But we always do it together." Rebecca's gaze snapped to her, cold and unyielding. "Not anymore. Go do it, now." Maria bit back a retort, her hands clenching at her sides. She glanced at Janice, who was staring at the floor, her rabbit cradled tightly. Without another word, Maria carried the plates to the sink, the clatter of ceramic echoing in the quiet kitchen. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Rebecca's requests turned into commands, her patience thinning with each passing hour. She dismissed the girls' questions with a wave of her hand and began enforcing strict rules that hadn't existed before. "No TV during the day," she announced one afternoon, snatching the remote from Maria, "and bedtime is at 8 p.m. sharp." "But Daddy lets us stay up until—" Janice started, her voice trembling. "I'm not your father," Rebecca interrupted, her tone icy. "And while he's gone, you'll follow my rules." Maria's chest tightened as she watched Janice shrink into herself. She wanted to speak up, to push back, but the look in Rebecca's eyes warned her against it. Instead, she placed a protective arm around her sister, guiding her out of the room. That evening, Rebecca locked the pantry, muttering something about keeping things organized. Maria noticed the key hanging on a thin chain around her neck, a small but glaring reminder of Rebecca's growing control. As the days turned into a week, Maria began keeping a mental tally of the changes, small acts of cruelty that seemed insignificant on their own, but added up to a suffocating weight. She waited for the sound of George's voice on the phone, hoping he'd sense something was wrong. But Rebecca always answered first, her tone sweet and reassuring, leaving no room for the girls to speak. "Your father's busy," she said when Maria asked for him. "Don't bother him with silly complaints." Maria clenched her fists, swallowing her frustration. She didn't know how long they could endure this, but one thing was clear. Without George, they were at Rebecca's mercy. The days began to blur into a monotonous cycle of fear and submission under Rebecca's unyielding control. Every morning, she stood in the kitchen like a commander, surveying her troops, issuing orders in her clipped, no-nonsense tone. Maria and Janice quickly learned that defiance, however small, was met with swift retaliation. "You didn't sweep under the table," Rebecca snapped one morning, pointing at an imaginary speck of dust. "Do it again." Maria knelt silently, the broom handle gripped tightly in her hands. Her shoulders burned from the effort, but she didn't dare stop. From the corner of her eye, she saw Janice sitting at the dining table, her face pale and drawn. Rebecca's shadow loomed over them both, an unrelenting reminder of their helplessness. Meals became a battleground. Rebecca served them just enough to quell their hunger, withholding treats or seconds with a dismissive wave. Janice's favorite snacks, ones their father had always bought for her, were locked away in the pantry, the key dangling mockingly from Rebecca's neck. "Eat what's on your plate," she said one evening, when Janice hesitated over the unappetizing dinner. "This isn't a restaurant." Janice looked up at Maria, her lip trembling. Maria reached out under the table, squeezing her sister's hand. "It's okay," she whispered, "just a few bites." But it wasn't okay. Maria knew that. At night, the house fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards or the faint rustle of the wind outside. Rebecca locked their bedroom doors after 8 p.m., a new rule she enforced without explanation. The sound of the key turning in the lock sent a shiver down Maria's spine every time. Huddled together in their shared bed, Maria and Janice whispered quietly, their voices muffled by the thick darkness. "Why doesn't Daddy call us?" Janice asked one night, her voice trembling. Maria hesitated. She didn't have the heart to tell Janice that Rebecca intercepted every call. "He's busy," she lied, brushing a stray curl from her sister's forehead. "But he'll come back soon." "Do you think he knows how mean she is?" Janice asked, her small fingers clutching Maria's shirt. "If he knew, he'd take us away, right?" Maria swallowed hard, willing her voice not to shake. "Of course he would," she said. "Daddy loves us. He'll come back, and everything will be better." Janice sniffled, curling closer. Maria held her tightly, her own fear buried beneath a resolve that grew sharper with each passing day. She had to protect her sister, no matter what. One afternoon, as Maria rummaged through an old drawer in search of paper for Janice's drawing, her hand brushed against something soft and worn. She pulled it out, a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. Her breath caught as she recognized the neat, flowing handwriting on the top envelope. It was Sarah's. "Janice," Maria called, her voice urgent but hushed. Janice hurried over, her rabbit tucked under one arm. "What is it?" Maria held up the bundle. "Mama's letters." The two of them sat on the floor, the sunlight streaming through the window, casting golden halos around their heads. Maria untied the ribbon with trembling hands, carefully unfolding the first letter. "My darling girls," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to say these words to you myself. But know this, I love you more than anything in this world, and I believe in you, with all my heart." Janice leaned against Maria's shoulder, her wide eyes scanning the words. They read the letters one by one, their mother's voice coming alive in the careful, loving lines. "Be brave, my sweet Maria. You have a strength in you that will guide Janice and yourself through anything. And Janice, my gentle one. Your kindness is your light. Hold on to each other and know that you are never alone." Maria wiped at her eyes, her chest tight with a mixture of grief and determination. She folded the letters carefully and tucked them back into the drawer. Sarah's words were a balm to their wounds, a reminder of the love that still surrounded them, even in her absence. That night, after Rebecca locked them in, Maria whispered to Janice in the dark. "We're going to get through this," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know how yet, but we will. Mama believed in us, and I believe in us too." Janice nodded against her shoulder, her trust unwavering. The days grew heavier, Rebecca's temper shorter. When Maria accidentally spilled water on the floor while refilling Janice's glass, Rebecca's reaction was swift and cruel. "Are you completely useless?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Clean it up and don't bother eating tonight. Clearly, you don't deserve it." Maria clenched her jaw, her hands shaking as she grabbed a towel. She didn't argue, knowing it would only make things worse. Later, in the safety of their locked room, she shared her portion of crackers with Janice, their silent rebellion against Rebecca's growing tyranny. The next day, the sun was relentless that morning, its rays baking the garden soil into a hard crust. Maria and Janice knelt side by side in the overgrown flower beds, their hands blistered and dirt-streaked. Rebecca loomed nearby, a parasol shielding her from the sun as she surveyed their progress. "You missed a patch by the roses," Rebecca called, sharply, her voice cutting through the still air. "And don't think about coming inside until it's done." Maria wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, her jaw tightening. She glanced at Janice, who was tugging feebly at a stubborn clump of weeds, her small frame trembling with effort. Maria reached over, gently brushing her sister's hand aside and taking over the task. "It's okay," Maria whispered. "I'll finish it." Janice didn't argue, sinking back onto her heels. Her face was pale, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. Maria's heart ached, but she forced herself to keep moving, her fingers working the earth with steady determination. Across the street, Megan stood at her kitchen window, her hands frozen mid-dish as she caught sight of the two girls. At first, she thought they were playing, but the sharp gestures from Rebecca told another story. Megan's chest tightened as she watched Maria rise stiffly, her hands clutching a pile of weeds, only to be met with Rebecca's scolding. Megan wiped her hands quickly and moved to the porch, pretending to adjust a hanging planter. From there, she had a clearer view of the yard. The girls looked frail, their movements mechanical, like they were too afraid to stop. Maria glanced toward the street, her eyes darting nervously. She saw Megan watching and hesitated for a moment, before quickly lowering her gaze. Rebecca hadn't noticed, too busy lecturing Janice about the proper way to hold a trowel. Megan's heart ached as she retreated back into her house. Something wasn't right. She had seen the girls before, bright, cheerful, always holding hands as they walked to school. But now, they looked like shadows of their former selves. Megan knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Later that afternoon, while Rebecca was distracted with a phone call in the living room, Maria seized the moment. She slipped out the back door, motioning for Janice to stay quiet. The girls had overheard Rebecca mention a long call with a client, which meant they might have at least 10 minutes before she came looking. Maria crept toward the side gate, her heart pounding. She peeked around the corner and saw Megan tending to her garden. Summoning all her courage, Maria opened the gate, just wide enough to slip through, and called softly, "Mrs. Megan." Megan turned, startled, and her eyes widened at the sight of Maria. The girl looked smaller up close, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her hands trembling slightly. "Maria, dear, what's wrong?" Megan knelt down, her voice gentle but urgent. Maria glanced back toward the house, her voice a whisper. "It's Rebecca. She's mean to us. She won't let us talk to Daddy, and she locks us in our room at night. I don't know what to do." Megan felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her expression calm. "How long has this been going on?" "Since Daddy left," Maria said, her voice cracking. "She yells at us all the time and makes us do things, like cleaning the whole house and the garden. Janice is too little for this, but she doesn't care." Megan reached out, placing a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. You were very brave to come to me. I'll figure out a way to help, but I need you to be strong just a little longer. Can you do that?" Maria nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Can you tell Daddy? He doesn't know. She won't let us talk to him." "I will," Megan promised, her voice firm. "I'll make sure he knows everything." Just then, the sound of Rebecca's sharp voice calling for Maria shattered the moment. Maria flinched, panic flashing across her face. "I have to go," she whispered, her hands twisting nervously. Megan pulled her into a quick hug. "Go on, but remember, you're not alone. I'll take care of this." Maria slipped back through the gate, her heart racing as she ran toward the house. Rebecca was standing on the back porch, her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed. "Where have you been?" Rebecca snapped. "Getting water," Maria lied quickly, holding up the empty watering can she had grabbed from the garden shed. She avoided Rebecca's piercing gaze and hurried past her into the house. Megan stood at her window later that night, her phone in hand. She had already found George's number from a previous neighborhood directory and was rehearsing what to say. Anger and sorrow churned in her chest as she thought of the fear in Maria's eyes and the exhaustion etched into Janice's tiny frame. Taking a deep breath, Megan dialed the number. It rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. "George, this is Megan, your neighbor," she began, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need to speak to you about Maria and Janice. It's important. Please call me back as soon as possible." As she hung up, Megan glanced at the girl's darkened house, her resolve hardening. In the following days, Rebecca's control grew tighter. She seemed to sense Maria's newfound defiance, her punishments harsher, and her demeanor colder. But Maria clung to the hope Megan had given her. Every time she passed the window and caught a glimpse of the neighbor's house, her heart steadied. "You think she'll tell Daddy?" Janice asked one night, her voice barely a whisper as they huddled together in their locked room. Maria squeezed her sister's hand. "She will," she said, with quiet certainty. "Megan won't let her get away with this." For the first time in weeks, Maria allowed herself a small flicker of hope. She didn't know when or how, but she believed Megan's promise. And for now, that belief was enough to keep her going. Having siblings is a wonderful thing. What about you listening to this story? If you are an only child, comment strawberry, and if you have a sibling, comment grape. Now, keep listening. The red-eye flight from London landed in the early hours of the morning, but George barely felt the exhaustion. His chest tightened as Megan's voice replayed in his head. She had called again, this time managing to catch him between meetings. Her words were measured but carried an urgency that set every nerve in his body on edge. "It's about the girls, George. I'm not sure how else to say this. They're not safe with Rebecca." George didn't ask questions. He booked the earliest flight home and didn't tell Rebecca. He needed to see for himself. The house stood in eerie silence when his taxi pulled up the driveway. The curtains were drawn, the yard unnaturally tidy, as if order had been imposed with cruel precision. A sense of foreboding gripped him as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. "Rebecca." His voice echoed faintly in the grand foyer. No answer. He dropped his bag by the door, his heart thudding heavily. Moving quietly through the house, he heard muffled voices from the back, one sharp and commanding, the others subdued and pleading. Creeping toward the source, he stopped just outside the kitchen. The sight through the half-open door froze him in place. Rebecca was standing over Maria, her face twisted with irritation as the girl scrubbed at a spotless counter. "You're slower than usual today," Rebecca snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. "Do it again. And this time, don't leave streaks." Maria didn't respond, her head bowed, shoulders hunched. Janice sat nearby, clutching her rabbit, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "I'm sorry," Maria murmured, her voice barely audible. "Sorry doesn't cut it," Rebecca hissed, slamming a towel onto the counter beside Maria. "You're useless, just like your mother." George's blood ran cold. He clenched his fists, his instincts screaming to storm in and put an end to it, but he forced himself to wait. He needed to understand the full extent of what was happening. Rebecca turned abruptly, her tone shifting to a mockingly sweet one. "Janice, darling, why don't you tell your sister how to do it properly? Or would you rather go without dinner tonight?" Janice flinched, her small hands trembling as she clutched her rabbit tighter. George's heart broke at the sight, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. Before he could step forward, another sound caught his attention, the faint creak of footsteps from upstairs. Rebecca straightened, her irritation melting into a sly smile. "That must be him," she muttered under her breath, smoothing her hair before heading out of the kitchen. George's stomach churned as he followed her, staying in the shadows. He climbed the stairs behind her, his movements silent. She paused at the bedroom door, adjusting her dress before pushing it open. Inside, a man was lounging casually on the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, a smug grin on his face. "Took you long enough," he drawled. Rebecca laughed, her voice sickeningly sweet. "I had to deal with the little brats. You know how they are." George felt the ground shift beneath him. The scene before him blurred as rage overtook him. He shoved the door open, the force of it slamming against the wall. "George!" Rebecca's face went pale, her voice a strangled gasp. The man scrambled off the bed, his grin vanishing as he hastily grabbed his shirt. "What the hell is this?" George's voice was low, cold, and brimming with fury. His eyes burned into Rebecca's, who stumbled back, her composure shattering. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, her hands shaking. George ignored her, his attention shifting briefly to the man. "Get out," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The man didn't hesitate, slipping past George and disappearing down the stairs. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but George raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "I trusted you with my daughters, and this is what you do." "George, please, let me explain." He turned away, storming back down the stairs. His first thought was of Maria and Janice. The girls were still in the kitchen, their wide, frightened eyes locking onto him as he entered. "Daddy!" Janice's voice was barely above a whisper. George crouched down, pulling both girls into a tight embrace. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Maria's small hands clung to his shirt as tears spilled down her cheeks. "She's so mean, Daddy," she choked out. "She locks us in our room, and she won't let us talk to you." Listening to such good stories is better with something to eat with it. What was the last dish you ate? Leave the name of it in the comments. We will continue now. George held them tighter, his heart shattering with every word. He stood, keeping the girls close as he turned to Rebecca, who had followed him into the room. "Pack your things," he said coldly. You're leaving. Now. You think you can just throw me out like this? She spat, her voice sharp and venomous. I've been here for months, running this house, taking care of everything you couldn't handle. Taking care of everything? George's voice was low, cold, barely masking the fury beneath it. He stepped closer, towering over her. Is that what you call locking my daughters in their room, starving them, berating them? And let's not forget this. He gestured toward the stairs, where only moments ago her lover had scurried away, like a thief. Was that part of taking care of things too? Rebecca's confidence faltered, her lips parting in a weak attempt to form a defense. You don't understand? No, you don't understand. His voice rose, the dam of anger breaking. I trusted you. I believed you when you said you cared about this family, about my girls. And all this time, you've been manipulating me, abusing them, and treating this house like your personal playground. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, her defiance sparking anew. Oh, give me a break, George. You're acting like you're some saint. Do you know how hard it is to deal with two ungrateful little brats every day? Always whining. Always needing something. Don't you dare call them that, George thundered, his voice shaking the room. They are children, my children. And they deserve love, not cruelty. You had no right to treat them the way you did. Rebecca sneered, her composure slipping further. You're pathetic, you know that? Always clinging to that perfect image of Sarah, like she was some kind of saint. Maybe if you weren't so busy grieving, you'd have seen the world isn't all sunshine and roses. George's face hardened, his eyes piercing into hers. Don't you dare speak about Sarah. You couldn't even begin to compare to her. The sting of his words made Rebecca flinch, but she quickly masked it with anger. You think you can just throw me out like trash? After everything I've done for you? George took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain control. No, Rebecca, he said, his tone quieter but more dangerous. You're not getting away that easily. You think I didn't notice the way you handled the finances? The way you conveniently let certain expenses pile up while pocketing money where you thought I wouldn't see? That's fraud, Rebecca, and I'm sure the authorities would love to hear about it. Her face went pale. You wouldn't. Try me. His voice was steel. You've lied, stolen, abused my daughters, and betrayed every ounce of trust I gave you. If you think I won't take this to the police, you're more delusional than I thought. Rebecca's hands shook as she gripped the banister for support. For the first time, real fear crept into her eyes. You'd ruin everything, Shiki. So they see sa good key, said Hags, her voice faltering. You'd drag the girls into this, into the courts, into public scrutiny. Don't you dare try to twist this into something about protecting them. George stepped even closer, his face inches from hers. This is about you. You made this mess, and you're going to pay for it. Rebecca's bravado crumbled, her voice turning desperate. What do you want, George? What do I have to do to make this go away? You leave, he said, his voice steady and resolute. Right now. Pack your things. Get out of my house. And never come back. If I ever see you near my daughters again, I'll make sure you face every consequence you deserve. For a moment, Rebecca stared at him, her mind racing for a way out. But the cold finality in his expression told her there was no room for negotiation. She turned on her heel, muttering curses under her breath as she stormed upstairs to gather her belongings. George stood rooted in the living room, his chest heaving, the adrenaline still coursing through him. Upstairs, he could hear the sound of drawers slamming and suitcases zipping, each noise punctuated by Rebecca's muffled muttering. He didn't care. All that mattered was that she was leaving. Minutes later, she descended the stairs, dragging a suitcase behind her, She stopped at the door, turning to face him one last time. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You think you're the hero in this story, but you're not. You're just a sad, broken man clinging to a perfect past that doesn't exist." George didn't flinch. "Get out." Rebecca glared at him, her lips curling in disdain, but she opened the door and stepped outside. The sound of her suitcase wheels scraping against the driveway faded into the night, and then she was gone. George locked the door behind her, leaning against it as a wave of exhaustion swept over him. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt both foreign and oddly comforting. He turned and walked upstairs, opening the door to Maria and Janice's room. They were huddled together on the bed, their eyes wide with worry. "She's gone," George said softly, his voice cracking. "She'll never hurt you again." Maria and Janice didn't say anything at first, but then Janice crawled into his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Maria followed, burying her face in his shoulder. George held them both, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his tears falling freely now. "I should have protected you. I promise, I'll never let anything like this happen again." And for the first time, in what felt like forever, the house began to feel like a home again. The morning light filtered through the windows of the once ominous house, now quiet, with Rebecca gone. For the first time in weeks, George allowed himself to sit still, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. The house, though silent, was heavy with lingering memories, some warm and filled with Sarah's gentle laughter, others poisoned by Rebecca's cruelty. He had failed to see the signs, and now all he could do was face his daughters and attempt to rebuild what was broken. He found Maria and Janice in the living room. Maria sat cross-legged on the floor, a photo album spread before her. Janice leaned against her sister, absently running her fingers over the tattered edge of her stuffed rabbit. The sight pierced George's heart. "Can I sit with you?" he asked, his voice soft. Maria nodded without looking up, her fingers turning a page. George lowered himself onto the carpet, the awkwardness of the moment pressing on him. He glanced at the album and saw Sarah's smiling face. Maria lingered on a photograph of Sarah holding her and Janice as babies. "You miss her," George said gently. Maria nodded again, this time speaking. She wouldn't have let this happen. Her voice was steady, but her words cut deep. She would have known. She would have stopped it. George felt the sting of her accusation, knowing it wasn't entirely unwarranted. He swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "You're right," he admitted. "Your mom would have seen what I couldn't. And I'm so sorry, Maria. Sorry for not protecting you, for not listening when I should have." Maria finally looked up, her eyes searching his face. "Why didn't you see it, Daddy? Why did you let her hurt us?" George hesitated, shame burning in his chest. I wanted so badly to believe that Rebecca cared for us, for you and Janice. I thought I was doing the right thing by bringing her into our lives, but I was wrong. I was blind to what was really happening, and that's on me." Janice spoke for the first time, her voice small. "She called us names. She said we were useless." George reached out, pulling her into his lap. "You are not useless," he said firmly. "You are kind and strong, and I'm proud of both of you. I should have been there to remind you of that, to protect you from her. I failed, but I promise I'll never let anything like this happen again." Maria looked back at the photo album, her fingers lingering on another image, one of the whole family sitting in the backyard, surrounded by the garden Sarah had loved so much. "I don't want to leave this house," she said quietly. "It's where she is. It's where she was." George felt his throat tighten. "I know this house holds so many memories of your mom, but it's also where so much pain has happened. I can't ask you to stay here if it hurts you." Maria glanced at Janice, who nestled closer to their father. "It does hurt," she admitted. "But if we stay here, it's like we're stuck. Like we can't move on." George nodded, his heart aching at the wisdom in her words. "Then we'll leave," he said. "We'll find somewhere new, somewhere we can make better memories. But Maria, the decision is yours. If you want to stay, we will. I won't make that choice for you." Maria stared at the photo for a long moment before closing the album. She took a deep breath and said, "We should go. Mum isn't just in this house. She's with us, wherever we are." Janice looked up, her eyes wide. "Really?" Maria smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's face. "Yeah, she's in our hearts. We don't need this house to remember her." George felt a swell of pride and sadness. He pulled both girls into a hug, holding them close. "We'll make a fresh start together," he said. "And wherever we go, your mom will always be with us. Always." They sat there for a while, the photo album forgotten, replaced by the comfort of each other's presence. For the first time in months, George felt a glimmer of hope. There was still so much to mend, so much to rebuild, but they had taken the first step. Was there a spark of the life they had once known? He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He couldn't undo the past, but he could build a better future. For all of them, the moving truck rumbled away, leaving behind a quiet street and a modest brick house with a sloped roof. It was a far cry from the sprawling estate they had left behind, but the new home carried none of the shadows of their past. Instead, it was small, cozy, and full of promise, a blank slate for new memories. George stood in the driveway, watching Maria and Janice explore the front yard. Maria examined the flower beds lining the porch, her fingers brushing over the wilted remnants of last season's blooms. Janice wandered toward a creaky swing set under an old oak tree, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "It's not like the mansion," Janice said softly, glancing back at her father. George crouched beside her, his eyes kind. "No, it's not," he said. "But maybe it doesn't need to be. What do you think?" Janice looked at the swing set again, and then at the house. "It feels warmer." Maria, overhearing, smiled faintly as she knelt by the flower bed. "I think it's nice," she said, her voice steady. "Mum would have liked it." George felt a knot in his chest at the mention of Sarah. He swallowed it down and placed a hand on Maria's shoulder. "She would have," he agreed, "and she'd love to see you planting something beautiful here." Inside, the girls wandered through the empty rooms, their footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors. Janice skipped down the hallway, peeking into each room. "This one's mine," she announced, stopping at a sunny corner room with a window overlooking the backyard. Maria lingered in the living room, her hand brushing over the windowsill. The afternoon light poured in, casting golden hues across the walls. She turned to George, who was unpacking a box nearby. "Are we really starting over, Daddy?" she asked. George paused, his hands resting on the edge of the box. He met her gaze, his expression serious but hopeful. "Yes, Maria, we are. No more looking back. Just forward. Together." Maria nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Then we'll be okay." That evening, the house began to come alive. Boxes were stacked neatly in the corners, and the scent of takeout filled the air. George had promised the girls a pizza night to celebrate their first day in the new home. They sat on the floor of the living room, using an upside-down box as a makeshift table. "Do you think we'll plant roses in the spring?" Maria asked between bites, her voice thoughtful. "Of course," George said, smiling. "Maybe even some sunflowers too. What do you think, Janice?" Janice looked up, tomato sauce smudging her chin. "Sunflowers are happy," she said. "I like that." George chuckled and reached over to wipe her face with a napkin. "Then sunflowers it is." After dinner, George retrieved a familiar bundle of letters from a box labeled Memories. The girls' eyes lit up as they recognized Sarah's handwriting. "Can we read one tonight?" Janice asked eagerly. "Of course," George said, settling onto the couch with the letters in hand. Maria and Janice curled up on either side of him as he carefully unfolded the top letter. "My dearest girls," the letter began, Sarah's handwriting elegant and deliberate. "If you're reading this, it means life has brought you to a new chapter. Remember, every ending is also a beginning. You are stronger than you know, and wherever you go, my love is with you." Maria leaned her head against George's shoulder, her expression soft. Janice clung to her rabbit, her small fingers tracing the edge of the letter. "Mom always knew what to say," Maria murmured. "She did," George agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And she'd be so proud of both of you. I know I am." Janice looked up at him, her eyes wide and earnest. "Are you proud of yourself, Daddy?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, then shook his head gently. "Not yet," he admitted, "but I'm working on it. And being here with you both, starting fresh, that's a good place to start." Over the next few weeks, the family began to settle into their new life. George made a conscious effort to be present, something he hadn't realized he had neglected before. He walked the girls to school, cooked simple meals with them in the evenings, and listened when they talked about their day. One Saturday, they spent the morning planting seeds in the front yard. Maria carefully pressed rose seeds into the soil, her hands steady and sure. Janice danced around with a watering can, laughing as she splashed water everywhere, including on Maria. "Janice!" Maria cried, but her laughter betrayed her annoyance. George watched them from the porch, his heart swelling. For the first time in what felt like forever, the laughter in his home was real. It wasn't forced or hollow, it was genuine, and it was healing. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, George sat in the quiet living room. The photo of Sarah he had brought with them rested on the mantel, her serene smile watching over them. He looked around the room, now filled with scattered toys, books, and the beginnings of a new life. "I'll do better, Sarah," he whispered. "I promise." The winter months melted into spring, and with the change in season came a blossoming of new beginnings. The small house, once quiet and unfamiliar, now hummed with life. The front yard was dotted with budding roses and tall golden sunflowers that swayed gently in the breeze, a testament to the family's collective effort to bring beauty back into their lives. Maria thrived in her new school, her sharp mind and thoughtful demeanor quickly earning her the admiration of her teachers. She joined the art club, where her sketches of flowers and quiet landscapes reflected both her creativity and her healing. Janice, on the other hand, seemed to light up every room she entered. Her giggles echoed through the hallways of her elementary school as she made friends with an ease that belied the hardships she had endured. One afternoon, George stood at the kitchen window, watching his daughters play in the backyard. Maria was seated on a picnic blanket, sketching the sunflowers she and Janice had planted. Janice ran circles around her, holding her rabbit in one hand and a pinwheel in the other. Their laughter floated through the open window, filling the house with warmth. "They're happy," George murmured to himself, a bittersweet smile on his face. He was grateful for the second chance to be the father they needed, but the weight of his past mistakes still lingered. He had resolved to confront those feelings, not to bury them. That evening after dinner, George gathered the girls in the living room. The three of them settled onto the couch, the bundle of Sarah's letters resting on the coffee table. George reached for the next letter, the one they had not yet read. "Should I?" he asked, looking at Maria and Janice. Maria nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Janice tucked herself under his arm, clutching her rabbit close. George unfolded the letter with care. Sarah's handwriting greeted them once again, the ink slightly faded, but the sentiment still vibrant. "My dearest family," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to a new home. A home that isn't defined by walls or rooms, but by the love you share within it." George paused, his voice catching. Maria rested her hand on his arm, encouraging him to continue. "Remember," the letter went on, "home is not where we are, but who we are. You three are my heart, my joy, my everything. Wherever you are together, I am there too. Be kind to yourselves and hold each other close." George looked up, his vision blurred by tears. "She always knew how to remind us what really matters," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Maria leaned forward, her eyes glistening. "She'd want us to be happy, wouldn't she? Even if it's not the same without her." "She would," George agreed, placing the letter carefully back on the table. "And I think we're getting there." In the following weeks, the family continued to strengthen their bond. George made it a priority to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. He helped Maria with her art projects, marveling at her intricate drawings. He played hide-and-seek with Janice in the backyard, her giggles pulling him from the shadows of his own guilt. One Sunday morning, they ventured to a nearby park for a picnic. Janice brought her rabbit, while Maria carried her sketchpad. George watched as they raced along the winding paths, their laughter blending with the rustle of the trees. "Daddy, come on," Janice called, her arms outstretched. George jogged after her, scooping her up in a playful hug. Maria smiled at them from a distance, capturing the moment in a quick sketch. For the first time in years, George felt whole. That night, as the girls prepared for bed, George tucked Janice in first. She clung to her rabbit, her eyes sleepy but content. "I love you, Daddy," she murmured. "I love you too, sweetheart," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. He found Maria in her room, arranging a stack of freshly sharpened pencils on her desk. "Good night, sweetheart," he said, pausing in the doorway. Maria turned, her gaze thoughtful. "Good night, Daddy. And thank you." "For what?" he asked. "For trying," she said simply. "For being here." George's heart swelled. "I'll always be here," he promised. Later, as the house fell quiet, George sat in the living room, the photo of Sarah in his hands. Her serene smile seemed to glow in the soft lamplight. "We're doing it, Sarah," he whispered. "We're moving forward. And I'll honor your memory every day by being the father they deserve." Upstairs, Maria and Janice drifted into peaceful sleep, their dreams filled with warmth and safety. The past still lingered in fragments, but the promise of a brighter future outweighed it. Together, they were not just healing, they were thriving. The house, once just a structure of bricks and mortar, had become a true home, filled with love, laughter, and hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.